spent half a lifetime in this institution as Korais Professor of Modern Greek. So wearing whichever hat is appropriate, welcome to the BSA and to King's College London. And on behalf of the BSA, we're obviously extremely grateful to Professor Gonda van Steen, the Korais Professor, and the staff of the Centre for Hellenic Studies here at King's for making us welcome this year. I think, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the format for our open lectures. There are 2 lectures back to back. The first is by tradition always given by the director, which is on the annual work of the school, and the second is by a distinguished outside speaker. So I will proceed to introduce the first of the lectures by the director, Rebecca Sweetman. There she is. Not far. Rebecca joined the BSA as director in September 2022, and she had previously been assistant director from 2000 to 2003. In between, she did a stint as professor of ancient history and archaeology at the university, at St Andrews University, where she was also for a number of years head of the Department of Classics. Rebecca's research, I'm sure it's familiar to very many of you, covers many aspects of Greek and Roman archaeology, Crete and the Peloponnese in particular, in both the Roman and late antique periods. She's worked on art and architecture, including mosaics, architecture of Crete and other parts of Greece, and her recent work on the Cycladic Islands in the Roman and late antique periods was funded by a Leverhulme Major Research Fellowship. Among her publications is an edited volume on late antique lived spaces with Carlos Machado, commissioned by Routledge, and eagerly awaited in press with Routledge, the Roman and late antique Cyclades, Networks, Economy and Religion. I'm sorry, not with the previous one with Routledge, this will be with CUP, when Rebecca's duties as director allow her to finish it. Life certainly changed at the BSA when Rebecca moved in with her family and other animals. Her 2 young teen sons, Connor and Aidan, have transformed the upper house once again into a family home. The dog Chewy actually runs the place. There's a more retiring cat, to say nothing of the long-term residents, the tortoises of the garden, who must have been there for centuries and will no doubt outlive us all. These are aspects of life at the BSA today that may or may not feature in the talk we're about to hear on the work of the British School at Athens in 2023. Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. It's as if Roddy knew what I was about to say. Good evening. It's really nice to be here. Huge thanks to the Centre of Hellenic Studies and Gonda for hosting us here, allowing us to be here. And thanks to Roddy for all his work in setting up the event. And of course to Flora, who did immense work, and the BSA team too. So let me start. It's been a jam-packed program for the BSA in 2023 with our fieldwork, research, academic events, outreach, knowledge exchange, and collaboration. I start, though, this work with the announcement of the Fitch Laboratories' year-long program of its celebration of its 50th year anniversary. In many ways, the Fitch epitomizes the school's ethos and mission, supporting and undertaking research in Greece and Greek lands through an emphasis on people and community in the past and in the present. The Fitch has been critical in creating and sustaining many of our research relationships and networks across the world, from our collaborations with the American and Austrian schools in Athens and Egina to work on Tintagel with Newcastle in the UK. The Fitch Laboratory is a beacon of our innovative approach in promoting STEM and women in STEM through mentoring and engagement. Together, the Fitch with the BSA are working at the intersection of arts and humanities, and sciences, of course, in a way that not many institutions are able to do. So, as the Fitch turns 50, keep an eye out for its exciting research and knowledge exchange activities as they're planned. We've really enjoyed getting to work with different communities this year. Our series of young archaeology workshops have given our colleagues opportunities to experiment with new ways of teaching archaeology. And in fact, in this case, you can see Carlotta Gardner's genius cake stratigraphy, what we all needed at university. We've also welcomed children from the Home Project. This is a project that looks after unaccompanied minors who are forced migrants, and they come every other week to the BSA to learn about archaeology. My children are always on hand with Google Translate, it has to be said. It's been wonderful working with the British Embassy and British Council so closely, and we're really grateful for the support of the Ambassador Matthew Lodge and his wife Alexia. Last year, we co-organized with them a writing festival with the theme of the journey, drawing on work of ancient and contemporary writers. While we all gained insights and new approaches to the concept of the journey, I think one of the big moments of this was the fangirl and boy moments with the brilliant Victoria Hislop. So thank you very much, Victoria, for coming. In addition to their contributions to life at the BSA, including the Finlay Forum and the less popular Gin Nights, the work of the school students makes invaluable contributions to its research agenda in its broadest sense. We spoke about our students Flavia, Liz, and Rachel last year. And I'm delighted to say that Flavia is now on a British Academy postdoc in Newcastle, and Liz is currently teaching in Liverpool. Rachel has returned this year to be Macmillan Rodewall's student, working on her postdoc project on Bronze Age mortuary practices. Andriana Zanacki is one of our Carey students this year, and she's examining settlement patterns in the mountainous areas of eastern Crete using statistical models and GIS applications. And Matthew Evans is our Richard Bradford McConnell postdoctoral student working on Hellenistic and Roman gymnasia. Our community of BSA fellows have been working hard this year on their cool, as well as, of course, on the serious business of research. The Leventis Fellow in Hellenic Studies is Dr. Tulsi Parikh, and we are hugely grateful to the Leventis Foundation for their ongoing support of this fellowship. Tulsi is working on the human experience of sacred space through movement and sensory engagement. She also uses her work to explore inclusivity and accessibility within archaeology. She co-organized a conference with Alexia Petsalis-Diomidis from the University of St. Andrews on inclusivity and material culture, and she regularly organizes outreach activities with underrepresented communities in Athens. The 1821 fellow, Dr. Michalis Sotoropoulos, has been focusing on knowledge exchange and the outreach side of the 1821 project, which is so generously funded by the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. The heart of the project are the archives of George Finlay and Captain Frank Abney Hastings. And key contributors to the project include its mentor, Professor Roderick Beaton, who is, of course, our chair, Amalia Kakisis, who is the BSA archivist, and Eleni Gatholu, our digital assets manager. And we also have two of the school's IT officers working on the project as well. The 3-day international conference, Philhellenism and the Greek Revolution of 1821 Towards a Global History, was co-organized with the National Library of Greece and the generous support of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. And it was here that Digital Finlay was launched. This is the new electronic catalogue of Finlay papers and the digitized items selected for this project, which are now freely available on the BSA's Digital Collections website. We will miss Michalis when he heads off to the Athens of the North to be the first lecturer in modern Greek studies in the University of Edinburgh. Last year, we reported on the work of our visiting fellow and early career fellow, our visiting fellow being Lindsay Koo, at last year's meetings. It is a great pleasure to say that Lindsay will be joining us on council from this spring. The school teacher fellowship went to Sazi Ahmed, head of classics at Kelmscott School, a multicultural state school in East London, and she spent a week in Athens in June on a BSA school teacher fellowship. We also enjoyed very much the work and the spark that the BSA and University of Arts London bursary holder in 2023, who was Joshua Whitaker. He spent spring at the BSA looking at the Delphic Oracle and St. Paul's presence in Greece. He also filmed a dance in the library, which I think must be a first for the BSA library. It was organized, it wasn't a random dance. Here are just 3 of the BSA conferences that we held last year, giving you an idea of the breadth of material from GIS to Byzantine to the conference that was organized by Gonda in honor of Roddy as well. Recent BSA publications include, of course, the annual archaeological reports and the archivist Amalia Kakisi's publication, superb publication, the edited volume on Byzantine and British heritage. Our digital assets manager, Eleni Gadolu, is funded through the British Academy, and she's collaborating closely with all departments to create and harmonize digital data and in the development of BSA digital humanities infrastructure. This will support information and knowledge sharing and wider public engagement. Nathan Mayer has been a huge help in this effort, and we're very grateful to him for his ongoing support. The work started last year on the Knossos spatial data is in its final phase. This data set includes excavation and survey sites, toponyms, and archaeological contexts in the Valley of Knossos, and that associated with the stratigraphical museum collections. It's been converted into a digital gazetteer of different levels of detail, as well as into spatial layers within a GIS prototype. This prototype will, in the future, integrate archival material, things like excavation diaries and plans, and link to the museum's objects. Thanks to the BSA archivist and also Eleni, the BSA is also currently leading on the joint BIRI digitization projects, which includes all 8 of the British International Research Institutes. And this is coordinated also by a new BSA colleague, Konstantina Georgiadou. We've been working towards standards and methodologies for developing a joint web portal to enable access to and facilitate querying and searching collectively in our resources. The BSA is leading the effort for adopting the digital storytelling platform and approach as a means to illustrate links between collections and to create engaging and interactive experiences for the research community and the wider public. We were, of course, delighted to throw open the BSA door to undergraduate and postgraduate students once again for our taught courses, including the glass course, which you see here, and also the online teachers course, numismatic course, and Byzantine archaeology and history course. We also, of course, had a hugely oversubscribed summer school, and no summer school is complete without a run in the Olympic Stadium, as you see here. Thanks to all who made such excellent contributions to the teaching, and in particular the organizers, Yorgos Mouratidis, Claire Rowan, and Rosanna Valente. There's one of the animals. The library has been its usual busy self and loves to welcome new readers, especially four-legged ones. The librarian made me say that. In May, Ursula Cope offered the Michael Freda Memorial Lecture, a Library University of Athens collaboration. In the first half of the year, Kira Holbon was the library archive intern for 2022-23, but sadly she had to leave the BSA at the beginning of 23 due to unexpected circumstances. Charlotte Townsend took up the position in May and stayed with us until the end of the year. And we also benefited from the help of Georgia Kapopoulou from the University of Athens. Over 200 map sheets and 5 rare books have been digitized and uploaded to the digital BSA platform this year. And this is the update you've all been waiting for. In more difficult news, it seems that Henry, named after Henry VIII, has made himself king of the cats in the library, ousting Callie, who has instead had to make her presence felt at every single upper house event, as we see here with Natalie Haynes. Much of our archivist, Amalia Kakisi's time, has been spent and the 1821 project, and as we said, overseeing the BERI Joint Digital Coordination and Strategy project. Amalia continues to accept and organize the cataloguing of donations and has undertaken a huge program of training interns and volunteers. Rosa Methel and Laura Kirkland, and later Sophie Stewart, worked on the Nicholas Coldstream personal papers. Later, Sam Newmarsh processed the Sylvia Benton personal papers, and he gave an excellent Finlay forum. And Amalia assures me that this wibbly photograph of Sylvia Benton is one of the best, and I suspect Kathy will confirm that she didn't like her photo being taken, so it's not that we were choosing poorly. Eloise Meyer undertook a variety of archive tasks on the Hood archive, and then in complete contrast, she catalogued the oldest BSA photograph album while also working on one of the newest collections, which is the BSA Lego collection of famous Greeks. Not made by us. We're not, other people make them. We're not sitting around making Lego figures, I promise. Shangyu Lin worked on the inventory of the Sinclair Hood archive. And we're also grateful to Melissa Rabnett, Alexander Simpson, and Emma Beaton for all their work in the archives. For the archive, Charlotte assisted the archivist and digital assets manager with the BERI digitization project. She inventoried corporate records and completed the catalogue of the 1936 exhibition, which was also the subject of her Finlay forum. And I think she particularly reveled in that because there was quite a lot of mystery involved around trying to put bits and pieces back together again. The BSA is, as always, grateful to individuals who've donated material to the archive. This past year, the Hood family sent more material for the Sinclair Hood archive, including additional photographic material and works of art, including pieces by Pete de Jong that you see here on the slide, and a Craxton as well, which has been donated to the Banaki Museum. The family of John Ellis Jones donated his papers related to his work in Greece, and we gratefully received some David French papers from his daughter Anne. Peter Bury donated a beautiful portrait of his great-grandfather, J.B. Bury. The Bader Lecture was delivered by the 1821 Fellow in Modern Greek Studies, Dr. Michael Soteropoulos. Turning now to the Knossos Research Centre, summer 23 was extremely busy with research, outreach, and knowledge exchange. There were 2 Knossos Research Centre summer lectures, one by Dr. Stella Mandalaki on dance rituals in Bronze Age Crete, and the other by Miss Evi Saleaki on board games of strategy and skill of the Venetian Guard of Spinalonga. The 4-day cultural festival, Earth, Water, Fire, celebrating Cretan pottery from antiquity to the present, returned after the COVID hiatus. Events included lectures on Cretan pottery with particular emphasis on the importance of the Thrapsano ceramic tradition as a living heritage, with workshops for adults and children and musical evenings with Cretan artists. The Villa Ariadne itself was also the focus of a series of 4 lectures on its people, building, and gardens. The BSA also hosted the audio installation directed by Magda Corpi of Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities. Those present were called upon to descend into the hinterland of Between, tracing the invisible world that lights the path for the experience of the visible. And on the 29th of June, the BSA joined the embassy to host the King's birthday party in 2023 at the Knossos Research Centre with Ambassador Matthew Lodge. And we'd like to take this moment just to send good wishes to the King for a speedy recovery. A large team of collaborators sowed flaxseed in the Knossos garden to produce handmade yarn, which will be woven using the Cretan traditional weaving techniques in an ongoing ethnographic project. And in fact, the summer's events came to a close with an ethnographic project at which the potters from Thrapsano set up a pithos-making workshop in Knossos, in the village, and introduced participants to the craft of making storage vessels. And we're very grateful to all our collaborators on all of these projects. As Kostis reports, a special mention should be made of the Knossos Legacy and Sustainability Project. Through its study of legacy material, it focuses on the analysis of ceramic assemblages from different chronological periods, while also training the next generation of ceramicists. The Knossos curator, Kostis, is focused on the stratigraphic museum rebuilding. In close collaboration with the Hellenic Ministry of Culture and Sports, the school will transform, the Knossos Stratigraphic Museum and the Knossos Research Centre by providing world-class facilities for future generations of scholars, ensuring the best possible storage and conservation conditions for our collections and for attracting a new academic audience. In terms of the Fitch, as we already mentioned, on the 29th of November, the Fitch will mark its 50th anniversary. As the Fitch was the first archaeological science laboratory in Greece, this actually marks half a century of archaeological sciences in Greece too. The Fitch team and volunteers coordinated by Carlotta Gardner, the Fitch 2024 Outreach Officer, with the help of our archivist Amelia, are using the lead up to this to investigate and record the history and contribution of the laboratory to the wider field of archaeological science in Greece, and of course beyond, which will be presented in a series of academic and public events. So keep an eye on the social media for news of what's coming up. Over the last year, the Fitch has opened its doors to a whole range of new audiences and even moved the laboratory itself to the Athens Technopolis in Gazi, participating in the Athens Science Festival last October. An important aspect of the Fitch vision is its growing connections with contemporary potting communities, with the aim of linking the two groups that study and/or make pottery. A range of ethno-archaeological and experimental work has taken place in Greece, and in the UK, we're developing a collaboration with the Craft Potters Association through our participation in the Spring Festival in London. Work in more than 30 projects has been undertaken in the last year, covering all periods from Neolithic to medieval and expanding beyond its main Aegean focus. This research has been undertaken by the Fitch staff, associate or visiting researchers, and international collaborators. Only two of the current projects will be highlighted tonight, starting with the main project of the current Williams Fellow in Ceramic Analysis, Sergius Menelaou. His research focuses on early Bronze Age Northeast Aegean, covering an interface zone between the Aegean and Anatolia, an area that's of crucial importance for the understanding of developments during the early Bronze Age, the 3rd millennium BC. This is a period of intense mobility and technological transfer, but also with evidence for cultural and social complexity and regional differentiation. This study, implementing a methodology that combines macroscopic morphostylistic examination of pottery with thin section petrography and elemental analysis through the WD-XRF of both pottery and geological samples, is the first to undertake a comprehensive analytical look at the prehistoric ceramic industry of key sites of this period, such as Polyochnoi on Lemnos, Thermae on Lesvos, and Emborio on Chios. Preliminary results indicate overall technological continuity with period-specific change. Significant amount of imports at each site, particularly during the mid-3rd millennium BC, signifies the intensification of connectivity of Lemnos, Lesvos, Chios, and Samos with several Cycladic islands, as well as sites in the western Anatolian littoral and other eastern Aegean islands like Imbros. Early indications are that these island communities were significantly more complex and interconnected than once envisaged, and comprise active social and economic hubs in different networks of mobility. Edita Marzak's research is on classical and Hellenistic Cyclades, part of a project called InSide. Beyond the study and analysis of pottery from Delos, Edita has also recently undertaken integrated macroscopic and laboratory analysis of ceramic materials from Tinos. Along with the analysis of raw materials from the island, this work has resulted in the identification and characterization of local pottery production in the classical and Hellenistic periods. Tenian workshops made a range of ceramic materials, including transport amphora, cooking and tablewares, weaving tools, lamps, and building materials, some of which were occasionally stamped with a symbol depicting a trident or an inscription, Tenion. Combined with the ceramic analysis from the French work at Delos, this study is showing that the Tenians were one of the major suppliers of Delos, especially in cooking pottery, lamps, and building materials. This helps to balance the focus thus far on products of long-distance trade with Delos during the late Hellenistic period. Finally, the Fitch hosted 3 training courses for 16 PhD students from a range of European universities as part of its participation in PLACE. That aims to train the next generation of archaeological scientists in interdisciplinary study of pre-modern plasters and ceramics from the Eastern Mediterranean. Thanks to all the contributions from colleagues at the Wiener Laboratory in Athens and UCL. We'll turn now to the BSA fieldwork projects. The BSA once again expresses its gratitude to colleagues in the Ministry of Culture and Sport for their support and collaboration, and as well as the numerous others in the ministry who make our archaeological work possible, and those in charge of the Ephorate of Antiquities in which fieldwork and study took place. We at the BSA could not do any of this work without the ever-positive and talented Tanya Yerusi, and this year joined by Nikki Papakonstantinou, who has seamlessly taken up the role of permit assistant as if she was always meant to be with us. The second excavation season took place at the Neolithic village of Toumbaseron on the eastern side of Stromian Valley of northern Greece. Colleagues at Toumbaseron are part of a pilot project for tetrarchs, which is funded by the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme, and it aims to revolutionize how archaeological data is collected and utilized, emphasizing its reusability for storytelling that engages diverse audiences. As well as supporting the development of the project's digital infrastructure and workflow, Tetrarchs is also working with the project's ethnographer, Ioana Antoniadou, to conduct a project stakeholder evaluation that will seek to explore the user needs of various groups with an interest in the project, including local communities, educators, and municipalities. The magnetometry survey was completed in November 2022, allowing the summer field season to start with a complete set of geophysical data. And the aims of this season were to characterize the nature, extents, and preservation of the deposits on the site and refine the dating of the site. They also aim to uncover a complete representative of the late Neolithic structure and to expose and examine the morphology of the large linear feature that appeared from geophysical survey to form the outer boundary of the site. Specifically, they were interested, the team that is, in establishing whether this was a wall or a ditch and bank structure. To that end, 3 trenches were opened to address these questions. Excavations in Area 4 revealed structures dating to the late Neolithic I period by ceramic finds, in addition to a stratigraphically higher structure which was badly damaged to its location just below the plough zone. The associated pottery suggests also a late Neolithic I building, indicating 2 phases of occupation in late Neolithic I. Work in Area 5 helped to characterize the boundary of the site, which was made of courses of mud brick and, in some areas, possibly a stone face. A possible external ditch was partially investigated to reveal 2 quite tightly flexed burials. These are potentially an unprecedented find, as there are no examples of late Neolithic burials in this part of the valley, although firm dating evidence of these individuals is yet to be confirmed. Work at Toumbaseron has confirmed the presence of structures linked to 2 phases of late Neolithic I activity on the site, while surface finds and background material continue to indicate the presence of late Neolithic II, but no structural evidence has been found in situ for this period, suggesting that either it's quite localized or it's suffered as well from being so close to the plough zone. The presence of human remains will be significant if they do turn out to be late Neolithic. Exploration of this area to establish whether there's a pattern of extramural burial and cemetery activity will form a key part of the research project in 2024. So turning to Chios, in collaboration with the effort of Antiquities in Chios, the British school, led by Andy Bevan, aims to conduct an intensive survey of a 10 square kilometre portion of southwestern Chios around the well-known archaeological site of Emborio. The project, the Emborio Hinterland Project, reports that their priority in 2023 was to achieve a wide coverage as possible of the area via pedestrian survey and complementary topographic and architectural mapping. They walked a combination, about 6.6 square kilometres. They walked 65,000 individual and 10-metre survey units over this area. And combined with the small 2021 survey conducted under COVID limitations and a delayed permit, about 75% of the mandated survey area has now been covered. Surveyors recorded counts of 50,000 sherds of pottery and 10,000 tile fragments on the landscape surface, and made permanent collection of 5,000 diagnostic pot sherds, as well as some napped stone. Preliminary results indicate a range of new sites of prehistoric, archaic, classical, Hellenistic, Roman, late Roman, and medieval date were discovered, while some other site locations from previous studies were this year re-identified, revisited, and better defined. Only a small amount of prehistoric evidence appears across the whole survey area, and at present, the team can only identify a few small prehistoric scatters and isolated finds beyond the excavated prehistoric levels at Emborio and the rescue excavations of the small site of Fouquet. A very limited amount of prehistoric napped stone was found, including obsidian that you can see here. Only one small scatter was found in the valley behind the Emborio harbour, and this produced, for example, the obsidian bladelet here, with the best comparanda actually being from the later Neolithic levels at Emborio, as well as coarseware potsherds and napped chert fragments too. This corroborates the pattern observed in the 1950s Emborio excavations, where the later Neolithic and Bronze Age assemblages were not particularly impressive in terms of lithics. This is a further indication that we should not let the high profile of the Emborio as publication mislead us about the relatively modest size and resources of the site itself, as well as the seemingly no density of other Neolithic Bronze Age activity nearby. This is especially clear if we contrast it with large contemporary sites on the opposite Turkish coast, such as Liman Tepe. A further dearth worth highlighting is the very limited surface evidence surviving from the 7th century BCE town and its environs on the hill of Prophetess Elias. In the 1950s, the excavators had already noted how eroded the deposits were, explained either as limited pottery deposition during the town's brief 100-year life, or that much of the evidence had been eroded downslope. The recording of a standing soil section below Prophetess Elias on the northern edge of the modern village of Emborio suggests the same thing, with evidence of stratified material such as pit and walling visible at some depth below hill-wash deposits. We need Carlotta's cake for this. In the Emborio Valley, a wider geological pattern of hilltop erosion and valley bottom buildup obscuring possible prehistoric to Roman land surfaces is visible. But this pattern is seen elsewhere on the island. For example, in the Comi Valley to the northeast, the same problem exists. Here, rescue excavations by the Greek Archaeological Service found evidence for a late Roman building a couple of meters down from the modern land surface. Our survey, they report, corroborates this pattern with amphora fragments found in sections at a depth of the modern riverbed and a series of dense pottery scatters at the eastern side of the valley, giving way to a blank area in the main valley. More straightforward is the very considerable amount of evidence across all periods from 650 BCE onwards, beginning in the Archaic and through Classical, Hellenistic, Roman, Late Roman, Medieval, and Ottoman. The Archaic period is, as we might expect, rich in comparison to other places. The Archaic period seems to be a peak period with a lot of coarse and fine decorated ceramics, tile, and surviving wall foundations at several sites. On the slide, you see two examples of some of the fancier archaic surface material, and the terracotta figurine head is one of several pieces of evidence suggesting a small, special site astride the modern road north out of Emborio and up towards the modern Mastic Museum. This roadway was clearly a key artery in the past, with many periods found along it and a long line of heavy-set walling on its east side. I do have slides behind me, don't I? I don't know what that was. We conducted a high-quality drone-based survey of major sites in 2023 and included a new rock art site on the northern slopes of Prophetess Elias, in which the underside of a small rock shelter had been painted in red pigment with a design of multiple circles with stems bordered by parallel lines. We're going to turn now to Samos, where in fact we have Nisha, who's part of the project here. They report, this year, work focused on intensively exploring the Karlovasi Basin in the northwest of Samos Island. 5 weeks were devoted to field walking, with 2 weeks of ceramic study and ethnographic work already having taken place earlier in the year. 2 field walking strategies were employed throughout the season. First, long test transects were walked in the area bounded by the villages of Hydrusa and Kondikia and by the river for Furniotico, with more intensive walking conducted at those points on the transects indicative of hotspots. Second, areas were walked with complete coverage that had been suggested as possible points of interest through ethnographic survey and local knowledge in the areas of Xerokambos, Aias Nikolaos, Vrisis, and Hydrusa. The density of pottery scatters was used to identify up to 18 possible areas of interest. Many of these yielded primarily early Byzantine pottery, notably with many fewer transport amphoras, but with more tablewares than had been found in southwest Samos in 2022. Worked ashlar blocks were located at various points, and few pieces of archaic and classical pottery were found this year, for the most part interpreted as those that had been washed down by the river. Sherds of this period were not found in enough number to constitute an area of interest. Preliminary work suggests that the majority of first millennium sherds were tablewares with late Roman and early Byzantine at Xerokambos and Hellenistic Roman at Hydrusa. The southwest region, close to the river, also yielded some pieces of archaic date, and most appear to have been locally manufactured in South Ionia. 108 points of interest were registered in an extensive survey, bringing the total number in the database to 288. Most of the points of interest were either built structures and clusters of ceramic or rock. In addition, there were 8 wells registered and 4 points noted for terracing features or for paths. Connectivity between the north and south basins was examined with a view to understanding the navigability of specific routes or pathways between the areas. And systematic acquisition of drone data was almost complete for one of the areas, and the presence of private property or military installations impacted on the other transects, and only features of significant interest from this area were imaged. And finally, we'll turn to Palais Castro, where 2023 saw a third campaign of underwater exploration with additional work on 2 submerged Minoan buildings, one of which, the rectangular structure of the Kouramenos Bay, is shown here. The Roman shipwreck from 2021 has now been photographed with illumination, allowing a better 3D model, as you see on the slide, and you see the wreck with lionfish. There's only an excuse to put in a picture of lionfish here. A second Roman shipwreck was also found in Cavo Placo area, And there are fewer amphora visible, possibly because of the shallower depth, which is between 6 and 12 meters. The types of amphora are pseudo-Coan, indicating a similar date of 1st to 2nd century CE to Rec 1. Remains of a modern wreck were also located close to the Grandes islets. There are traces of wooden hull with bronze nails still visible too, and it probably dates to the 19th century, if not a wee bit earlier. Geophysical survey was conducted in 2023 with both ground-penetrating radar and resistivity. Areas of both Kouromenos and Chiona bays were covered with the aim of revealing indications of buried structures adjacent to submerged and excavated structures identified in the project to date. Results from the East Beach at Chiona were particularly encouraging. Here we see the ground-penetrating radar indicating more walls adjacent to the remains excavated in 2022. Moreover, the underwater resistivity points to a possible structure under the sand in the shallows also. During our season in July and August, we were faced with the daunting task of sorting and joining a particularly large pottery deposit excavated on the Chiona promontory last year. This deposit consisted of 12 jars, some of which were found intact on the floor, while others had fallen from an upper level and broken into many pieces. The range of shapes and decoration is fascinating, and when the study is completed in 24, it'll give us a remarkable insight into the storage practices in LM3A, particularly in this neighbourhood, about which we previously knew very little. We were also able to strew and catalogue pottery from Trench 2 and Trench 4, the latter study confirming the occupation of this zone from the early Protopalatial period, and that this is contemporary with the adjacent burial ridge. That concludes our research and outreach. Before I give the floor to Roddy, who will introduce Nisha, I'd like to remember a few of the BSA greats who have died this year. Jonathan Musgrave worked on human skeletal remains from numerous BSA projects, from Myrtos Pyrgos in Crete to Koukos in Chalkidiki. His work on the occupants of the Vergina tombs with John Prague is still of fundamental importance. And recently, Diana Wardle, a BSA student from 1971, had a deep association with the BSA and its excavations. She was an excellent draftswoman with an immense knowledge of Greek costume, and she always had a warm welcome for everyone, be it on site or in her kitchen. In terms of BSA staffing, we said goodbye to Kate Smith, our London administrator and development officer, who's gone on to do great things in Bristol. And we welcomed Flora Michalaki to take up the position in London, and Katrina Gallagher to the role of Public Engagement and Development Officer in Athens. Just recently, we said farewell to Miles Stevenson, our development executive, who really professionalized the BSA's fundraising, and we hope it won't be long before we see him at a BSA event. And finally, while this job feels a little like herding tortoises sometimes, I would like to say a huge thanks to all the staff of the BSA in Athens, Crete, and London, and a particularly huge thanks to our Deputy Honorary Treasurer, Hugh Smith, and Chairman Roddy Beaton. And Hugh sometimes likens himself to a fire dog, who give their time and energy so cheerfully to the BSA. And it's really above and beyond the call of duty, the things they do for the BSA. So a huge thank you, personal thank you, to Roddy and Hugh, and on behalf of the BSA staff, who welcome them every time they come to Athens. Thanks also to BSA Council and BSA subcommittee members, BSA Friends and their chair, Mary Christine Keith, and the committee, publications team, Olga is here, supporters, BSA Friends in Greece, and everyone who works behind the scenes in supporting the work of the school, and to all of you here. Thank you very much.
Well, you did get Chewy and the tortoises at the end. I never cease to marvel at just how much gets done at the BSA year after year. And it's a small team, it's a small place, but it has lots of friends. Many of you, all of you, are here tonight. And there's some kind of magic chemistry, I think, about the small, dedicated professional team on the spot in Athens, at Knossos, here in London, who are actually at the sharp end. And all of us, I suppose, at varying distances around, as it were, the outside, who, thank you, Rebecca, it was nice what you said about you and myself, but there are so many of us who love the BSA in so many different ways, and it's great to be able to contribute to this work and to hear about it as we have done tonight. So thank you so much for the presentation, but also congratulations on the work that you and the team have done over the last year. We move to tonight's second talk. Naoíse Sweeney is Professor of Classical Archaeology at the University of Vienna. And before that, she was a lecturer and then Professor of Ancient History at the University of Leicester. Her research focuses particularly on the construction of identity and cultural interaction, especially social formation of communities, their cultural practice. And from what my understanding is that the identity, the way that we construct the sense of who we are, lies at the center of Naoíse's work. She has a current project on migration and mobility around the Mediterranean in the Iron Age called Migration and Making of the Ancient Greek World. Nothing new under the sun, is there? And it's funded by a grant from the European Research Council from 2020 to 2025. Naoíse is the author of no fewer than 4 single-authored books, 1 co-authored, and 1 edited volume. Many of you will know her 2018 book, Troy, Myth, City, Icon. And that book, marvelously, in only 200 pages, tells you everything you always wanted to know about the subject, including the latest thinking, and also what's wrong with so much that you thought you knew already. With her most recent book, Naoíse joins that small and admirable band of academic specialists who in the last decade or so have dared to push the bounds beyond their subject specialism to apply their knowledge and understanding to big issues that confront us all, but in a manner fully accessible to the non-specialist reader. This is what it looks like. The West, a new history of an old idea. It was published only a year ago by W.H. Allen, and it featured as a BBC Radio 4 Book of the Week. It's had some rave reviews, and also, I think, aroused its share of controversy, which I'm guessing is rather part of the point. In tonight's talk, Professor Sweeney is going to introduce us to her novel take on the long history of the West, and in the process, I suspect, artfully linking it to the subject of her previous book about Troy, the one with which BSA supporters may perhaps be more immediately at home, namely the history, the myth-making, and the archaeology of Troy. So let's welcome Naoíse Sweeney to talk to us on the heirs of Agamemnon, or the progeny of Priam, ? Mythical genealogies, and the invention of the West. Naoíse, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much, Roddy. I'm going to try and switch PowerPoints seamlessly and beautifully. Is that working? Yeah. That is magical, magical, magical. I'd like to start by echoing Rebecca and Roddy's thanks to Gonda, to the Centre for Hellenic Studies, to the BSA team, and to all of you for being here tonight. And I actually want to pick up on something that Roddy just said about the magic of the BSA community. I've not been as active in the BSA as I should have been, perhaps for some years, or as I used to be, and I have missed it. And the opportunity to come back and to feel how special this community is again has been really fantastic. So it's really a pleasure to be here. As Roddy suggested, tonight my talk is not really about my current book. I gather this is quite a high-powered intellectual audience, and so I thought I'd delve into something more specific and meaty and detailed. But hopefully this will also link into broader themes, broader questions, and a broader kind of significance. So the theme today is the mythical genealogies linked to the Trojan War. And I'm interested in this because the way that people construct their mythical genealogies is a way of coding the way they think about themselves and about the world around them. And the mythical genealogies that we, broadly speaking, have constructed back to Troy have, over the centuries, been a kind of proxy for the way we think about Europe and Asia, us and them, Occident and Orient. And so if we trace the changing ideas about mythical Trojan ancestry, we can actually see, I think, the invention of the West. Let's see if I can persuade you over the next 33 or 4 minutes or so. But I don't want to start with the big questions. I want to start with this image. It's an image from Jacob Meinel's Fürstliche Chronik, published in 1518. Meinel was an academic, a lawyer, but he was also the court historian of the Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. In this capacity, he was a prolific author, producing no less than 6 volumes of Habsburg family genealogies. What riveting reading for an evening. This particular image comes from his work, and it's the beginning of the Habsburg family line. And as Meinel proceeds to explain, the Habsburgs are drawn from 3 elevated lineages. This is just the first page. The image is, the diagram goes on for further 19 pages. But we'll just do the one tonight. On the left, there is the Linea Hebraeorum, or the Hebrew line. In the first ring, we see the name of Boaz of the tribe of Judah, and he's followed by his descendants through to the biblical David, Jesus Christ, the succession of popes, right up to Pope Leo X, and they are all linked by golden rings, symbolizing the sun and the highest spiritual status. On the right, you can see the Linea Latinorum, or the Latin line, linked by silver rings, which symbolize the moon and the supreme territorial power. Aeneas is the name in the first ring, and he's followed by all the legendary kings of Rome, Julius Caesar, Roman emperors, down through Clovis, and then the Holy Roman emperors, culminating, of course, in our friend Maximilian, who has sponsored this publication. And if we were confused about what this line means, there's a little figure on the top carrying an orb and a scepter to symbolize that temporal power. But what's really interesting is the lineage in the middle. It's held together by iron rings, which symbolizes the strength and the power that are adorned on either side by the spiritual and temporal authority, but it's also backed by the smooth trunk of a living tree to symbolize the natural and live nature of this particular genealogical line. It's a line that is interestingly labeled as the Linea Graecorum, or the Greek line, but it starts with somebody who we would not usually think of as a Greek hero. Typically, it starts with the name Hector, the crown prince and champion of Troy. And then it leads down through the centuries, through the Franks and the Germans, down once again to the Habsburg family and Maximilian, but ends in his grandsons Charles and Ferdinand. In Meinel's vision, the Habsburg line here, headed by the imperial bird, the peacock, is the living genealogical core around which the twin poles of spiritual authority and temporal power are arrayed. And originally, the Habsburgs were the end point and the acme of all 3 of these lines. They were the dynasty that brought these 3 genealogical lineages together. Maximilian himself made this claim explicitly in his autobiography, or thinly veiled autobiography, the Weisskönig, written a few years before Meinel published this chronic. And in addition, Meinel's predecessor as the Habsburg royal historian, Johannes Stabius, also traced the Habsburg ancestry back along precisely these three elevated genealogical lines. For the Emperor Maximilian, these mythical genealogies were not just a bit of fun or something to talk to with your historians and academic colleagues, but they were also the core of his imperial ideology. They were a cornerstone of his claim to legitimacy, his claim to universal empire and the right to rule. And he celebrated them as conspicuously and as frequently as he possibly could. The original design for his tomb in Innsbruck, never quite fully completed, but it should have included 40 over-life-size bronze statues of his ancestors, alongside 32 Roman emperor busts and 100 statuettes of Habsburg family saints. In this rather lovely monumental painting by Albrecht Altdorfer, it's 109 sheets of vellum long, which is over 100 meters long. It's a very long painting. It depicts Maximilian having a Roman-style triumph. And behind his triumphal carriage, there are a procession of 16 bronze statues of his ancestors. And just a final example, in this fantastic woodcut of a triumphal arch by Albrecht Dürer, made up of 192 woodcut panels. At the very heart of it, we can see, Maximilian's genealogy represented, a line that stretches back through lots of illustrious named male ancestors, but which ends in three female personifications of his ancestral homelands, Francia, Sicambria, and ultimately, finally, Troia, which is just here at the bottom right. I hope you can see her. But it's not just Maximilian, this particular one emperor, who was consumed by genealogy, ancestry, and descent from Troy. This is an obsession that seems to be shared by a lot of the Habsburgs, not just the Eastern Habsburgs of Austria, but also their cousins in Spain as well. It was also an obsession shared by some of their great rivals in continental Europe, including the Capetians and the House of Burgundy in France. This is a family tree that appears at the start of Le Maire de Belge's Illustration de Gaulle et Singularité du Troie, and it links the Linea Gallorum, the line of the kings of France, unsurprisingly, to the Linea Troianorum, the line of the kings of Troy. It's true of the Habsburg houses, it was true of the French royal houses, it was also true of England's own Tudor dynasty. The Tudors also played on the story, first attested in the 9th century in the Historia Britannorum of Nennius, but perhaps more famously repeated by Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 12th century, the story that the British were descended from Trojans via a descendant of Aeneas called Brutus. And Elizabeth I was particularly enamored of this story, this idea of Trojan origins. And during her reign, we see an explosion of references to especially royal ancestry leading back to the house of Priam. And this is just a lovely little quote from a play that was produced in her honor by the young scholars and lawyers of Gray's Inn. And it describes Elizabeth as that virtuous Virgo born for Britain's bliss. Gosh, that's a lot of alliteration. That peerless branch of Brute, that sweet remain of Priam's state, that hope of springing Troy. And this is a rather lovely painting. It's one of several which are quite similar, which represents Elizabeth in the guise of her ancestor, undertaking the judgment of Paris. But of course, where Paris's judgment ended in war and in tragedy, Elizabeth is not going to make the same mistake, because of course she manages to persuade all of the three goddesses that she outshines all of them in their own particular fields, and she is the one who is, of course, Caliste. In the words of the Master of Magdalen College, Oxford, when Elizabeth came to visit her, people considered that omnia sunt tua, tu, Juno, Minerva, and Venus. So that's here at home in England. At the other end of Europe, there's interest in Trojan origins too. The idea of descent from Troy also attached itself to the Ottoman Turks. Now, the sources for this are perhaps a little more sketchy. They're not from any official Ottoman archives, but at the heart of it is the idea that the Ottoman Turks were also descended from Trojans, and that the conquest of Constantinople was a justified retribution against the Greeks for the sack of Troy. According to the Ottoman historian Michael Christoboulos, Mehmet II, Mehmet the Conqueror, was apparently keenly aware of this, visiting the ruins of Troy himself. And according to Christoboulos, he is reported to have said, shaking his head a little, "God has reserved for me, through so long a period of years, the right to avenge the city and its inhabitants. It was the Greeks who ravaged this place in the past, and whose descendants have now, through my efforts, paid the just penalty after a long period of years for their injustice to us Asiatics." Now, whether Mehmet actually ever said this is another thing altogether, but the idea that this is the kind of thing that he might have said was an idea that was very appealing, and certainly to a lot of Italian commentators. There are a number of texts which were produced by anonymous Italian scholars around this time, some of them taking on the voice of Mehmet II, and they come up with things like this. This is supposedly a letter written to the Pope by Mehmet, who claims that I am a Teucrian, born of Teucrian blood. Father, Papa, we were Trojans. We were the remnants of the nation of Priam, whom the Greek generals could not destroy in their cruel war. So we've got a situation then in medieval and early modern Europe where everybody wants to be the progeny of Priam. We've got the Ottomans, we've got the British, we've got the French, we've got the Habsburgs of Austria and Spain, but also, so too, apparently the Normans, the Saxons, the Teutons, the Scythians, and even if you read the Prose Edda, the Norse gods as well, all claiming that they are descended from Troy. I did this lovely schematic quite late at night. I hope it kind of gets my point across. So there's all the kind of various peoples of Europe saying that they came out of this Trojan family tree. And I hope you recognize who this is at the bottom of the tree. It's, of course, Aeneas fleeing Troy. So we have a situation that by the end of the 12th century, the English chronicler Henry of Huntingdon could remark quite wryly that most of the peoples of Europe, plerique gentes Europae, claimed descent from Trojans. The popularity of mythical Trojan descent was not just Europe-wide from north to south and east to west. It was also very, very long-lasting. It's something that we start to see in the 10th century or so, but which really gathers pace and gets kind of to peak popularity in the 12th century. And I thought I'd just show you some lovely extra manuscripts from this time, including this one by Rigord, which again traces the ancestry of the Franks through a guy called Francio, who I'm not aware of from the actual classical text, but never mind, who was supposedly the oldest son of Hector. Great. But against him, I thought I'd just show you one other lovely choice quote from the Speculum Regum of Godfrey of Viterbo, who traces the genealogy of his particular sponsors, not the Habsburgs, I've lost their names. I've completely forgotten their names, I'm afraid. The previous dynasty of Holy Roman emperors, through all the line of kings and emperors of the Trojans and the Romans and the Germans from the time of the flood to the present day. Hohenstaufens, that was it. I'm sorry, this is the Hohenstaufens. And it carries on from here, from the 12th century, for another 500 years or so into the 16th century. So the longevity of the popularity of Trojan origins is quite significant. And I wanted to put this quote up because it captures for you why. It gives you the explanation for why it was so popular for such a long time. A claim to Roman ancestry was a claim to the legitimacy, the power, the authority of Rome. Of course, what we were missing from the family tree was this in the middle. A claim to Trojan ancestry is a claim of the translatio imperii, the transfer of imperial power from one empire to the next. First there was Troy, then there was Rome, and now there is us, whoever the us happens to be. And all of this is just to stress that the mythical descent from the mythical Trojans was extremely appealing to a very wide range of people for quite a long time. For a long, 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 long time, until suddenly, almost overnight, it wasn't. And I think we can pin down exactly when the shift happens to a few decades at the end of the 16th century. It's a shift that we begin to see in the 1570s, spearheaded by Maximilian's own grandson, the Habsburg King of Spain, Philip II. In 1571, Philip commissions the Basque historian Esteban de Garibay to compile a new genealogy of his family, a work that eventually took de Garibay 27 years to finish. I know how it's like to write a book, but I hope I never take 27 years. But he published bits of it in dribs and drabs, and he concluded that the Habsburgs had a dual lineage. One lineage that went back along the western side through the Romans and ultimately to the Trojans, but another lineage that went back along the eastern side through the Byzantines and ultimately to the ancient Greeks, the erstwhile enemies of the Trojans in the Trojan War. So while the Habsburgs were still the progeny of Priam, they were also, at the same time, also the heirs of Agamemnon too. These dual competing lines of descent are flagged even more clearly by another genealogist, Francesco Sixto, a few years later in 1573. In his genealogy of the Spanish Habsburgs, Sixto did not set up the Trojans and the Greeks as two parallel genealogies, but as mutually exclusive alternatives. You can either go back through the Trojans, or you can go back through the Greeks. You can't have both. He says there are two opinions regarding the Habsburg descent from Noah. One is that they descended from Cam by the Trojans, another from Sem through the Greeks. So we've had a situation where for centuries we were all the progeny of Priam. And now, for a while, you could be both Trojan and Greek, and then just a few years later, you can either be Trojan or Greek. And then a few years later, you're just Greek. By the end of the 16th century, we're increasingly beginning to see that Europeans are writing Troy out of their own histories, excising it completely from their imagined mythological genealogies. By 1598, in his treaty of about the Spanish monarchy and empire, the Calabrian philosopher Tommaso Campanella was able to exclude the Trojans entirely from the Translatio Imperii, replacing them wholesale with the Greeks. And this is something which would have been unthinkable in just 100 years previously, at the start of the 16th century. This, I think, is not just a change in what people thought about history or the past. It was also a fundamental shift in the way they thought about themselves in the present too. Europeans did not think of themselves any longer as being the progeny of Priam, but instead they considered themselves to be the heirs of Agamemnon. Now, of course, by this time, it's the end of the 16th century, the Renaissance is in full flower, and people across Europe are beginning to learn more, understand more, appreciate more about Greek antiquity. But what I'm trying to talk about today is not just about rediscovering the ancient Greek past or educating yourself in it. What I'm talking about is something much more shocking, much more radical, much more transformative, thinking about your fundamental identity and how you relate back to that past. For centuries, you have seen the ancient Greeks as just one amongst many peoples of antiquity, and indeed a people who supposedly did an historic injustice to your own ancestors, the Trojans. And then, within the space of a generation, boom, The ancient Greeks are no longer your ancestral enemies, but instead they are the originators of your own cultural and intellectual heritage. You identify yourselves with them. This is a 180 degrees turnaround. And this is what we find as we move into the start of the 17th century. And here's just a choice quote from the jurist, politician, and scientist, and all-round Enlightenment man, Francis Bacon. He argued that only 3 cycles and periods of learning can rightly be counted. One among the Greeks, the next among the Romans, and the last amongst us. That is, the nations of Western Europe. Note that. And it's worth noting that at this point, the rhetoric is not about a bloodline, a biological genealogy anymore. Instead, it is about not biological ancestry, but cultural heritage, culture, learning, knowledge, civilization. As Bacon claimed himself, the culture was a sacred relic which he felt he could receive. So we have then a shift, a dramatic shift in historical imagining. For more than 5 centuries, the imagined genealogy of most Europeans looks something like this. And yet, within the space of about 30 years, at the end of the 16th century, the imagined genealogy becomes completely transformed in 4 ways. Firstly, it's now imagined as a cultural rather than a biological genealogy. Secondly, we find a few additional branches being added to the top, like in North America and some of the colonial worlds. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly for us in this evening's lecture, the roots of the genealogy have changed utterly. They are no longer Troy, but they are instead Greece. Aha, but what is the 4th thing, I hear you ask? Those of you who are still awake. The 4th thing is what is not on this slide, and that is the Ottoman Turks. The 4th thing is the removal of an Asian Oriental branch to the family. And the clue to how this happens actually comes back from our old friend Sixto. Not only is the Trojan line definitely different and separate from that of the Greeks, but it's also got a different kind of a vibe to it. It's looking quite Asian and African, definitely not European. And this is actually at the heart of what's going on. The removal of the Ottoman Turks and their shifting to a completely different civilizational, genealogical, imagined mythical line is at the heart of this reimagining of European identity. This is a moment of civilizational redefinition, when Europeans begin to see themselves as fundamentally distinct, separate from Asians and Africans, entirely and qualitatively different groups, separated by geography, but also by religion, Christianity versus Islam, but also by culture, by learning, by knowledge, by civilization, and, for us particularly in this room, very interesting, also by history. It's a moment of historiographical innovation, a moment of reimagining your mythical ancestors, this abrupt switch from the progeny of Priam to the heirs of Agamemnon. And it's in this moment lies the origins or the invention of the modern West as we know it. Now, of course, I don't think this is the first moment, the exact moment in history when Europeans first ever began to think in this way. Of course, there's a lot more going on here, the beginnings of European imperialism for a start, but I do think that it's crucially, this is the moment where things begin to make the switch. And the answer to why at this particular point in time is something which lies back again with our friends, the Habsburgs. The same Habsburg king of Spain that sponsored the rewritings of his mythic genealogy, Philip II, also sponsored a huge propaganda machine to celebrate the victory of the Catholic Holy League over the Ottoman fleet at the Battle of Lepanto in, note the date, 1571. And here we see him in a famous painting by Titian offering his baby son to a winged Nike or victory figure while a captive Turk lies bound on the floor. The 16th century also saw the scaling up of tensions between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs, not just in the land-based power of the Eastern Habsburgs, threatened by the siege of Vienna in 1529, as well as the long, constant wars in Hungary from the 1530s through the 1560s. But we also have, this is the peak period of the naval power of the Spanish Habsburgs being threatened too, with the siege of Malta in 1565 and everything finally coming to a head in Lepanto in 1571. And to make things worse, the tensions between Catholic and Protestant powers in Europe meant that the Ottomans had allied themselves to several of the Habsburgs' Protestant enemies, the Huguenots of France, the Calvinists of the Netherlands, and were tentatively reaching out to make an alliance with Elizabeth of England too. The late 16th century was the peak of Ottoman power, and it was also the peak of Habsburg-Ottoman rivalry. Small wonder then that from a Habsburg perspective, the idea of mythical origins in Asia shared with the Ottoman Turks, this all becomes less appealing. And so too then the image of the Trojans changes. They're no longer the heroic ancestors of Roman emperors and European kings. Instead, they're increasingly characterized as foreign barbarians, as Asian others. They're likened to contemporary Asiatics. And the Habsburgs, as well as other Europeans, decide to find themselves some more suitably Western, suitably European forefathers in the form of the ancestral enemies of Troy, the ancient Greeks. Now, again, I do want to stress that I'm not suggesting that Habsburg anti-Ottomanism was the sole reason for the invention of the West and that it all lies on mythical genealogies. Of course, at this time, we get an increase in rhetoric about the idea of a united Christendom, but rewriting history also did have an important role to play. It allowed the Habsburgs to represent their rivalry with the Ottomans as something civilizational, something natural, something eternal. And I think we're all quite familiar with this equation of the present and the ancient past, this equation of the Asiatic of the present with the Asiatic of the past. And we have seen this again through the centuries. You, like me, probably grew up with textbooks which perhaps maybe communicated something a little bit like this, William Gladstone's sentiments about the Trojans, that they were more given to the vices of sensuality and falsehood, and certain fundamental features of distinction which have always been more or less observable between the European and the Asiatic races. It's also the same kind of thinking which allows very esteemed and important and well-respected historians to write things like this, a not so recent but not so old book by a wonderful historian, Anthony Pagden, who does claim that the conflicts between East and West, of which Al-Qaeda's war with the West is just the latest manifestation, are so old they belong to myth. They began with probably the most famous war in history, fought between the Achaeans and a quasi-mythical people of Asia Minor known as the Trojans. This is an idea of the clash of civilizations, us against them, East against West, and it's coded in to the way we think about the Trojan War. Now, as a society, 21st century society, we might be tempted to think this is kind of normal. We're quite used to hearing rhetoric like this by now. It's inevitable, it's trans-historical, that there's a truth of a clash of East versus West. But I think that what we've seen tonight together tells us that this was not always the case. This was not always how Europeans thought. In fact, what we've done tonight is we've pinned down the precise moment in time when Europeans began to think like this. The story, perhaps, is familiar. The idea of the Habsburgs, they're not the first and certainly not the only European power who was under threat from a neighbor in the East, who employed an ideology of anti-Orientalism in order to justify themselves. I'm sure quite a few of you, when you're hearing that, are thinking this instead. As many of you probably in this room are perhaps more familiar with, this is something that we've seen before in the classical world as well. This idea that imperial Athens after the Persian Wars in the 5th century also cultivated this idea of a cowardly, dastardly, luxury-loving and servile Oriental, in contrast to the manly, freedom-loving European Greek. And as many of you will also know, probably much better than I do, that the story of the Trojan War was reinterpreted as well in the contemporary political light of what was happening in Athens at the time. What had, in a previous generation, been a tale about mortality, heroism, and aristocratic individualism was transformed and became instead a fable of a clash of civilizations, a story about Europe against Asia, Achaeans versus Trojans, Greeks versus Persians. I don't really want to talk about this tonight, that's not the topic of my talk, you probably all know this only too well, but I do want to flag this up as another comparable moment of civilizational redefinition, a pivot point where people thought about themselves and thought about mythical history in a radically different way. I do very quickly want to flag, though, that even at that moment of civilizational redefinition, there were people who were dissenting. There were alternative voices, which can also be heard. This is a coin minted in a Greek city in the Chalcidice Peninsula, which features on it the mythical head of its founder. And some of you might be able to read, if it's a good enough image, the name of the city in reverse, and the name of the city comes from the name of its founder, Enea. So this is Enea, a Greek city, which even at the height of the 5th century is proudly claiming to have been founded by the Trojan Aeneas. And Enea itself is not alone. Now, I'm not going to go into this. This is another talk for another evening. Some of you have heard this other talk, and I'm sorry to see the slide again. But across the Greek world, there are communities, Greek communities, who claim ancestral origins back in Troy. Proudly Greek communities, but also proudly Trojan ones too. We, just to kind of tie this all together and release you all to go and have drinks this evening, we right now in the modern West, this is where I'm circling back to the book eventually, we are also in a moment of civilizational redefinition. We are right now rethinking who we want to be, and that necessitates, as a result, rethinking where we came from. And this is quite frightening, and some people find it quite threatening. But actually, I think it can be quite hopeful and quite exciting too. There is potential for refashioning and reformation of who we are in the West. And I want to end where I started then, with this particular image. It's really my favorite image of the week. And I want to just dwell on the fact that the linea Graecorum, or the Greek line, starts with a Trojan prince, Hector. And I think that we, as we are in our moment of civilizational redefinition now, we can take perhaps some inspiration from Jacob Menel. We can perhaps take inspiration at the fluidity that he permits, the lack of rigidity in defining where people come from, the plurality, the idea that all these three lines, these lineages, could eventually come together. And I think, thinking about Menel and his colleagues, it's pretty obvious that we can think about history one differently if we choose to and if we dare to. Thank you very much.
Well, Nisha, that was absolutely spellbinding. Thank you. I don't know where to start. And I do see drinks at the back of the room, as you pointed out to us. You could see them, we couldn't. So it is quite late. But what a marvelous tour de force. A tour in various senses, in various ways. But I just love the way you focused in on these original documents, on these images, on these these books that, as you describe them, no one would probably want to read, but, you've delved in there and found them. This is, it's not a second-hand sort of resume. This is what the genealogists at the time thought was going to earn them a place at court, and presumably it did. So, this counted for something. Lovely to see our own Elizabeth I on the same tree as Mehmed II, the conqueror. And of course, and yes, they were all descended from, Hector. I mean, doesn't it just show what you can do with inventing the past? And of course, for those of us who are Hellenists, I mean, who invented the past first, or as not better, but as well as anybody else? I mean, all these mythical genealogies that ancient Greek history is based around, down to the very, Helen himself, or Ion, or Aeolus, and so on, that everybody's projecting the present back into the past. And I think you've shown really how the past is, or can be, something really fluid, really active, and also perhaps disconcerting, as you suggested, up for grabs too. So, you watch, who's going to grab our past for us? And how do you negotiate these things? I thought that was absolutely marvelous. Thank you so much. Thank you. So a very big thank you to both speakers, to our hosts here at King's, to all the BSA staff and colleagues who are with us, as well as Flora Michalaki, who actually works in London. About half the BSA has actually decamped on Aegean yesterday. They're with us in the room today, and it's wonderful to see them all here and all together. Do have a chance to talk to them over a drink at the back of the room. Thanks to one and all, and a very big thank you, congratulations to Nisha McSweeney. Thank you.